parking is free to most of us most of the time. But just because the driver doesn't pay for it doesn't mean the cost goes away. The cost is still there. That somebody has to pay for it, and that somebody is everybody. One example that I think is prominent in Honolulu in your current thinking is how it affects the price of housing. When cities require each apartment to have one or two or even three parking spaces, then that cost can be very high in Hawaii. Land is very expensive and construction is very expensive. Ulupono sponsored research on the cost of housing and parking, and they found that just one parking space cost about $110 a month, up to $410 a month, depending on whether it's on the surface or in a structure. So if you get an apartment with one parking space, it could be that $400 of your rent is paying for that parking space. It seems free. But it has to be paid for somehow. And if it's required for housing, it goes into the rent. So we end up having free parking and expensive housing, which is the wrong way around. And everything has a parking requirement. Say grocery stores have a parking requirement, and the cost of the parking has to go into the price of the food. So people who are too poor to own a car have to pay for parking so that the richer drivers can park free at the grocery store. So I think that the cost gets spread around in the wrong way. Planners didn't impose this on unwilling residents. It's a democratic process. Everyone wants to park free, including me. But that doesn't mean we should make free parking a principle of land use planning and public finance. The parking requirements began to spread just after World War II, when the country was prosperous and everybody had cars. It just seemed natural that we should require every new land use to have plenty of parking, because we assumed that people would have cars. But that reduced the cost of parking so much, it increased the number of cars we wanted and the more we wanted to use them. So I think it slowly accumulated, and it seemed to be natural that everybody should be able to find a free parking space wherever they go. Well, every city has pages of parking requirements. Is it for a nail salon? How many parking spaces are needed before you get permission to open the nail salon? That you simply cannot open a restaurant without all the required number of spaces. So when you look at the pages and pages of parking requirements, they look very scientific, sort of like 3 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet. Uh, but there's not much thought that has gone into those. But when the students get a job, they find out they have to begin enforcing the parking requirements. That before anything can open or be built, they have to. The home builder has to show, or the developer has to show, that they have all the parking spaces that the city requires. So it's a very precise but highly inaccurate planning process. Something small seems small can be very big. So I say that for lack of an open parking space, there's a shortage of parking. So cities require off-street parking. And then if they require off-street parking, that spreads land uses apart because there are parking spaces between the buildings. Um, and then that means the cars are more necessary to where you're going. It's harder to walk and to bicycle if you if there's a lot of traffic and things are far apart. So I think that, and then for all that traffic causes air pollution, now we worry about carbon emissions. So I think it seems hard to believe that a small thing like the lack of an open parking spaces can spiral into global warming. But I think it has, that we have so much parking, and park car is the natural way to get to most places, that we just take it for granted, and we expect to park free when we get there. So I'd say that the original sin was mismanaging the curb parking. Yes, well, the parking meter wasn't invented until about 1935, so it was hard to price parking at all. And most parking spaces are not metered. They're free. There may be a time limit, but most parking spaces are free. Um, and I think that that's what we want. Everybody wants free parking, but when it's in a crowded area, and you get to your location, you have to drive around hunting for parking, cruising for parking. And the percentage of the traffic is cruising. You can't look at the traffic and know who's cruising for parking. You don't know the driver's motives. But studies that have done on 4 continents over now 90 years found that on average in congested areas where all the curb spaces are occupied, about 30% of all the cars are hunting for parking. Say that is, if somebody hunting for parking, their car was painted yellow. You would see 1 out of 7 cars would be yellow. Uh, um, so in some areas, at the highest, something like 87% of all the cars were cruising. So I think it's between 0 and 100% of the cars are cruising. But if you're in a downtown congested area where the traffic is heavy and slow moving and all the curb spaces are occupied and free, most of the traffic may be cruising for parking. And the solution that planners have offered to this is to require off-street parking, so you won't drive around hunting for curb parking. You just pull off into a parking lot, and it's free. So I think that the original sin of charging nothing for curb parking is what has led to many of the mistakes that we have made. So it's essentially the lowest price the city could charge and still have 1 or 2 open spaces. And when San Francisco started this, first with 7,000 parking meters as a pilot program, and then all of the city after that, all the city meters after that, uh, I got my biggest surprise is that the prices didn't go up on average. They actually declined by 4% in the first 3 years. And that's because the parking was so overpriced in the morning. There were a lot of empty spaces in the morning. And they changed the price every 3 months. And it took 3 years for the price to get down to 25 cents an hour. And other parts of town, it went up to $6 an hour. And on average, all the prices declined by about 4%, which means they stayed the same. So it just means the prices moved around. The prices were down in some areas at some times and up in other areas at other times. So I think that's then the parking performs well. It's well used. Most of the spaces are occupied, but it's readily available, and you can't do anything better than that. But I think that, as you say, it's not the easiest thing to do, but the technology now makes it possible. Most people think of the parking meters like the first ones that were introduced in 1935. You put your money in the meter and you hope to get back before your time runs out. Now, how many payment mechanisms have not changed since 1935? But that's what parking meters are. It hasn't gotten any better in 85 years. But the technology, unfortunately, most of it comes from abroad. in parts of the world where they do charge for parking, has made it very easy. You can set prices. You don't have to touch the meters. They operate by looking at the license plate of the car. You don't pay for parking, your license plate does. And they can the enforcement people can just look around and see has that license plate paid for parking. Uh, so I think that the parking, if the parking performs well, the business will perform well, because nobody will say there's a shortage of parking, and they'll be able to employ more people, and the prices will go up and down automatically. The cities could give a discount to low-income people, just as they give a lifeline rate for electricity, natural gas, and water to low-income people. They could give a discounted parking rate to low-income people. Um, and that means the parking wouldn't be free to everybody. It would be free or cheap only to low-income people. So you don't have to give free parking to the well-off in order in a misguided attempt to help the poor. I think it's a very very bad way to think. This is a good anti-poverty program is to have free curb parking. I think it's much better to make the parking cheap for low-income people. But I wouldn't stop at that. I say if you're giving a subsidy to low-income drivers, you should also give the same subsidies to low-income people who can't afford a car. I think it's very unfair to give a subsidy to drivers who are poor and nothing to people who are too poor to own a car. So I think it would be fairer to give a discount. And when it comes to parking requirements, cities, certainly in California, they almost all give allow lower parking requirements for low-income housing. That we say that you shouldn't, that if there's a specific group of people you want to help, you shouldn't give it to everybody. I think Boulder, Colorado has a very good program as they put in their parking meters, and they offer free transit passes for everybody who works downtown. So it's the parking meters downtown that pay for the free transit passes. So all the downtown employers give a free fringe benefit to their employees. If you work for me, you get a free transit pass, not at my cost. So richer drivers who come to downtown pay for transit for the people who work there. There's something specific to Honolulu that I would recommend is that it happens in tourist areas, and of course Honolulu is unique. But in Miami Beach, they have a lot of tourists from the north, and they had crowded curb parking. And they wanted to put in parking meters, and they have a very clever system that they charge you by license plate. It's your license plate that pays the number, pays shows that you've paid for parking. You can pay for it with online with your cell phone, and some new cars, the app is in the dashboard. The dashboard is the one that pays for the parking because it knows its license plate and its location. But the meters say you can also pay the meters $4 an hour. But unknown to the visitors, anybody who has a Miami Beach license plate pays only $1 an hour. So it's like Monty Python's idea to solve Britain's economic problems is to tax foreigners living abroad. So if you thought all the tourists would be going to Waikiki and they would say that they would see the meter said $6 an hour, they would pay for it. And stay maybe for a shorter time than they otherwise would. You try to tax the tourists. And the easier way to do this is to give a discount for residents. I think that would be very easy to do. And everybody who rents a car and drives around, they don't know what's happening. things. One is to remove all street parking requirements. The second is to charge the right price for curb parking. And the third, which is really to begin with, is to send all the meter revenue back to the metered areas. I think that those three are the main policies that I would recommend for Honolulu.